Okay, everybody, welcome back to the second half of my misty view over Central Park Lake. This is not 100% dry, but it is dry enough that I can now move on to the more final stages and finishing touches. Just to recap, the lights are there, the unpainted parts of the paper, the lighter midtones and the darker midtones are all established. Now, the big thing to do are the darkest darks, which will be the trees that frame the view. And first, however, I want to indicate just a hint of these distant towers sticking up beyond. The last thing to do here is to make too big of a deal out of them, to make them too dark or too specific. So much as I love these buildings and would love to draw them, it wouldn't be a good idea. So what I'm using is a very inexpensive flat brush to just sort of imply them. The flat brush allows me to scrape the shapes down into the tree area and let them just vanish a bit. And then your other free brush, your finger, you can use to just feather the edges. So yeah, just hinting, very, very pale and indistinct. I think that's more than enough. Again, I love these, but they are not the star of the show. So the last thing I want to do is be too specific about them, or they could really ruin the whole mysterious effect of the painting altogether. Again, I love the combination, the clash, if you will, between the natural and man-made worlds. So I think just the introduction of them at all is a good addition to the painting, if not absolutely necessary. I think it will make the painting a little bit more poetic. Yeah, I think that's fine. And I think they look as if they're just sort of merging, melting into the trees, and it all becomes just one shape. I'm going to use a slightly wet paper towel to just feather the edges and make the effect even more subtle. That's good enough. Yeah, the dark trees are coming in. I think I want to put some identity in the water. I could either do that now or later. Probably later is best, after the trees are established. Cool, so tree painting. Like painting anything else, there really isn't an answer. There just works for you. Your artistic DNA, if I can use that term, really comes out when you paint trees. It's your brush work, the way your arm, your hand, and body move. So trying to copy or mimic or imitate anybody else's style of painting trees is really a no-win situation. I just don't recommend it. But you can watch how other people do it and maybe work up some useful tips that you can use when you do yours. I use one of these, or I have a bunch of these. These are, if you can see it, sort of a barrel brush, but it's a type of a liner. It has a larger barrel at the bottom before the ferrule, where it contains a lot of water, and then a few longer quills sticking out of the top that really are for sign painting and that sort of thing. Da Vinci makes these in their Casenio series. Escoda makes these. Neef makes some. I have a whole lot. This is just a fairly cheap one I bought off the street in Italy somewhere. I'll show you why I like it, but again, it isn't an answer. Or not the answer, but it works for me. one of the things I think that goes wrong when we try to paint trees is if you draw them too much, you just run the risk of painting in between the lines and making them look very tight and rigid. This brush, this type of brush, and also because I work on very textured paper, allows me, if I mix up a water pigment puddle there and don't use too much water and a fairly light touch, you can just scrape it over the surface of this textured paper. And if you're lucky, you get these very organic looking shapes that look very, I think, appropriate to foliage. They look aerated and you can see light through them, which in this particular painting is a big plus going for that look. And yeah, it works for me. It may work for you too, but it may not. Everybody has different brushes. I've seen people use flat brushes or all kinds of things to stamp, or to take an old brush and just chop it up with a penknife or whatever you have. Anyway, there's more than one way to get there. As far as color I'm using here, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It does, but I'm not thinking much about color as I am about value. I'm painting the areas of foliage first, and I'm using a jadeite green, and I did drop a little bit of alizarin in it in my palette. So any two neutrals you mix, any two complements, that is to say, will make a neutral, and with very little water, they'll get quite dark, or can. But the green-red complement mix is one of the most beautiful you can get. With a deep green and a deep red, I'm using, again, alizarin, dropped in a little of it into a jadeite green, but a perylene green, Windsor green, which I don't use but would work beautifully for this. Any deep green with a red dropped in as a complement will go quite dark, pretty nearly black, but still remain a relatively high amount of transparency. So I'm trying to keep contrast and clarity maximized in this area, and then less so as it radiates out from the center of interest, which is going to be here. Almost always, the center of interest of your painting is going to be where the lightest light meets the darkest dark. So that isn't an absolute rule, but it's kind of a rule of thumb. And it's going to be the case here, where the darkest darks are going to be here and here, and the lightest lights are going to be in a band here. So that's where your interest is going to go. It's the reason I put in two groupings of trees, so to try to set up a left-right connection between this side and that side of my painting. As the trees grow up nearer the top of the page, so away from the center of interest, I'm using a bit more water, and then I dropped in, instead of any alizarin, some burnt sienna to soften the greens, to lighten the saturation, lighten the contrast. All of those little things help push the center of interest back down to where you want it to be. I don't want really, really light necessarily, or really dark values leading me off the page unless it's on purpose. Almost always when I'm painting trees, my approach is to do the areas of foliage first, working fairly quickly as I can, and then the major branches, trunks, structural parts of the tree after I do the foliage, and then allow both of those to bleed together, wet and wet, so they look attached. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm always looking for connections in my work. I'm always looking for better, more organic ways of making all parts of my painting look attached one to the other, so nothing looks as if it's pasted on or wandered in from some other painting. So all this noodling around I'm doing is fine, but I've got to work pretty quickly because I don't want this to dry before I can put on the major areas of trunks and branches. So to get these leaves to look leaf-like, it's just necessary to play around with your trial and error to get the right amount of pigment and water mixed so that they look natural, organic, and convincing. For the areas of trunks, I'm using a Van Dyke Brown, pretty opaquely, a smaller mid-sized flat brush to sort of scrape in the major areas of trunks and branches. You can see I'm intentionally not being especially careful about this. I want some of these dry brush scrapey marks to appear here and there. I think they'll just help the tree look more convincing. Flat brush is handy for this. You can lay it on its side and imply some smaller branches that way if you want. But for this initial stage, I'm just trying to get the bigger structural parts laid on. So here and there you can see the leaf area is bleeding up into and melting into the trunks and branches, and that is good. That's what I want. I'll go to smaller brushes in a moment to get a little bit more detailed here and there, but those are the major areas of trunks. Very little water, a lot of pigment. That's the way you get these really crisp, deep edges. I'm using a dark sepia for this. So it's much like a burnt umber, but a dark brown. Could be almost anything. I like the dark brown. It sort of vibes off the green and makes a little bit of a complement vibe. So I work into the smaller areas of branches and trunks. I'll go back to this smaller flat brush. You can drag these areas right up through the wet parts of your leaves, and it all melts together here and there, and sometimes not, and that kind of looks good too. So you get a lot of variety. I think the key to doing convincing trees in watercolor is often just that variety. Different shapes, especially in greens, different types of green, more fresh green, deeper greens, greens modified with reds here and there, perhaps even with blues. Just a lot of variety really is the key to, for me at least, to get more successful trees. These are not real trees, as you remember. I'm just inventing them, so it's quite liberating. I can make them look any way I want. I'll go to one of my small mop brushes for the smaller bits of branches, and these you can apply almost opaquely with a very light touch, somewhat like calligraphy. It's best if you don't think too much or almost none at all, and just allow the brush to sort of tell you where it wants to go. You know, that sounds very tricky, but honestly it works, or it can work. You just sort of listen to what the painting needs and resist the urge to overdo it. Obviously, I'm going for the sort of diagonal energy throughout the painting, which is good, but I want a few contrasting bits. It wouldn't flow if there were no water, clearly, but there's very little water. It's more pigment than water. That's how you get the dark tones. And I'm really not pressing down hard. I'm just lightly pulling the this brush over the surface of the paper. So I'm using the smaller bits in to counter the large, more aggressive shapes going that way. Some sort of complementary smaller diagonals in the opposite direction can be a nice addition. You don't want it to look crazy, so a little might go a long way, but it generally works pretty well. I took some calligraphy courses in Japan years ago, and oh my gosh, obviously it takes a lifetime or maybe more than a lifetime to be really good at it. But I did pick up some useful tips, and generally it's to try to paint less with your fingers, more with your whole arm or body if you can, to paint intuitively rather than intellectually, to modify the pressure when you push down or pull up. And all of this is fairly easy to do if you just know what you're hoping for and then just practice, trial and error. Pushing down too hard, I think, is one of the worst things. Very delicate, gentle, almost no pressure. And then you can get these sort of start and stop lines that can be quite beautiful if you're lucky. As all things with painting, it's so much fun that it's hard to make yourself stop sometimes, and it's very easy in that way to do too much and to overcook your subject. So thinking too much is not good, but you have to be also alert that you're not over baking the cake. Generally, as big shapes, it looks pretty good. You can start to add some finesse here and there, some extra bits if you think it really needs it. So there is some thinking involved, but not too much. It's mostly intuitive painting. Doing my best to make these trees really vanish off the bottom so that, again, the interest is up here in the center. To that end, I'm going in and adding, this isn't dry yet, but it's getting there, so I'm adding little bits of pigment here and there to really beef up, well, fairly subtly, but to beef up the contrast that I want to occur here and then here. Also to that end, I think I can use this little this smaller mop brush to add additional foliage if I think it will help. So for example, here where this trailing twig comes down off the tree, I could add a sort of choreography of leaves that hopefully makes it look a little more elegant and refined. Also adds more interest, more texture, more contrast right here in the center of focus area. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, you can play this game all day and really overbake your painting. So trying hard not to do that. Right, I think I'll just leave that for now. But this little technique helps you sort of add a little finesse to edges that you don't really like, or to cover up something maybe that you think looks pretty bad. Overall, it's fine, so I think telling myself to just back off. Okay, now I'm going to do a somewhat similar technique over here in this other bank of trees, and then you'll have all the major elements of the painting done. Back to the liner brush. Again, reasonably opaque mini puddle here of jadeite green. I'm going to put a bit of alizarin in it to deepen it, to go for this dark. Yep, looks good, but I think you can press the brush down in the palette to squeeze a little bit of water out if it's too juicy. It's the other great thing about watercolor is playing around with different types of washes and paint applications. So within the same painting, you can go from really subtle wet and wet to pretty aggressive dry on dry, or dry into wet. You can get this range of expression in watercolor. Like, I just don't think you can do it as well. I can't do it as well in any other medium. It's so natural to watercolor because of its fluid nature. So I'm adding these foliage groupings, as you can see, but I'm trying also within that to make a pattern of them so they don't just look like indiscriminate blobs along the paper, but have sort of hopefully a rhythm to them and allow enough air and light to show through the tree and branch groupings to allow this final rhythm to be established. The light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light. It's working, but I just am bearing that in mind. I don't want to cover up everything with these areas of trees, but on the other hand, I want to get enough coverage that these foreground trees have substance and a little bit of strength. Yeah, I don't know about that. That's okay. Yeah, I think that looks fine. It's a little assertive up here, and I really wanted it soft, so I'm going to just take a moment. I'll flip this upside down. I'll mist this area of trees at the very top, just to make them a little less distinct and, sorry, draw a little less attention to themselves, soften them a bit. Yeah, generally I think that's better. I will clean up some of those edges later, but yeah, I, again, really want the contrast down here, but not up there too much. So back down here, I'm going to thicken up this paste of jadeite and alizarin. Think about my next foliage shape, and I think I like this rhythm, so I want to keep it going down this way. But I think I do want a grouping of the tree trunks to show through pretty clearly, so I don't want to cover that all. Yeah, that works. Right. I'll bring these over just a bit and then just let it feather off the bottom. Okay, so before it dries again, just like on the other side, I'm going to go in with some deep browns, warms, very little water, more opaque, and carve in my major areas of tree structure, trunks, branches, and that sort of thing. The bigger shapes. Then with the smaller brush, of course, the smaller shapes. So this is the medium flat. Really letting the water and pigment just run out at the bottom of the page so I keep the bottom as hopefully mysterious as I can. Can't even see what little lines I drew at the very beginning, so I am, the technical term is winging it here, which is good. But I think it's fine, no worries. I'll go back to my little small mop and start to drop in some smaller parts of the tree structure. Still quite wet up there, and that's good because all those areas then will melt together just a little bit, so they won't hopefully draw too much attention to themselves. I like this overall grouping of foliage, but I don't think the edges are very elegant, so I can finesse that by dropping in some additional foliage and hopefully some nicely etched smaller branches. Some of them you can just brush right off. In this sort of dry brush technique, it's obviously a matter of how much pigment and water is in the brush, but it's also a matter of how much pressure you apply and then lifting off. So if you start harder and lift off, you'll get these really, I think, compelling scrape marks, almost allowing a lot of air and light and luminosity to show through. So I want these trees to look pretty unkempt and lyrical, but a bit ragged as they stretch down into the water so that they don't look too manicured or perfect. Again, it's just a little note of contrast between the very structural city beyond and the really, the sense of wildness in the foreground. Big shapes I'm happy with, but again, a little more finesse I think is needed here in the midsection. Okay. Now with the really nearly opaque jadeite, I'm going to add a few more, like I did here, some individual leaves or groupings of leaves. I'm just sort of pushing the brush in to give what I hope will be a little bit of finesse or elegance to these trailing vines and twigs that come down into the water right across our field of mist. Yeah, and it just cleans up. Well, it doesn't really clean up. It adds texture to this edge, but I think that's a good thing because it looked a little abrupt before. So now it has a bit of a more finessed edge to it. This looks a little clunky, so I can add a few little leaves up there, and I'll probably put in another trailing twig or two down over the sky. I'm okay with this. Down here, again, I don't want to be too specific because I want all that to just trail off into the bottom of the painting. So now, water. Oh, I've struggled painting water. I look back at some of my older paintings, and even though there might be parts of them that are pretty good, I'm startled by how much I overpainted areas of water. I think in watercolor, almost, I mean, there are exceptions to everything, but almost always, the less you do in an area of water, the better off it's probably going to look. We're dealing with a very misty day, so we want the whole feel of this painting to be kind of not jittery and jumpy, but calm, contemplative, not sad, but so anyway, if I draw water that's too agitated, too many marks in it, it's every mark I put on that water is going to take away from the overall sense of serenity and calmness that I've worked pretty hard to get. So I want to add just a few identifiers, marks in the water, to tell the viewer that it is in fact water and that it's receding into the distance. But to do that, the viewers are smarter than we think, usually. People's imagination is another one of my obsessions, but it's a lot stronger than we think or that we give it credit for. So as a painter, what I mean is you don't have to tell the viewer everything. If you just include a few little indicators, the viewer's eye will fill in many blanks and they will tell themselves a lot of the story. You don't have to specify everything. So yeah, I think that's sort of enough. I think another paler version, trailing off just a little, but this is where where I can really blow it. I have to just be extremely discreet and show just a little. Like that, for example, is too much. So while it's wet, I'm just going to soften that. Yes, and that's much better. I don't really think it needs any more, the water. I'm not altogether sure that it needs any more here or there, but I think I will include just a few little water identifiers. I rather like the fact that I didn't paint out those unintentional skip marks that happened early on. I think they kind of help inform the viewer that this is in fact water, a little bit of light sparkle there. I don't find that distracting, In another context, I might, but I think it's fine, so I'm just gonna leave it. Yeah, here under the trees. Again, the other thing you don't want to do is be too terribly specific, because another thing I was going for was to have these trees just fall off the bottom of the page in a fairly mysterious manner. So yes, I think that's fine. One little thing I'm going to do to try to anchor this, but also to emphasize the mystery at the bottom, I'm going to do upstrokes. This is a Escoda brush, a versatile 3/4 inch flat. I love this brush, but it's very handy for any number of things. But if you want to add like a little value without running a whole glaze, and also to add some additional texture if you think it needs it, brushing up from the bottom sometimes will help you get there. So I think you can see it's adding obviously a bit of value to the bottom of the painting, but without running a deep dark glaze over it all. So you're not really losing anything. It's just additive. And I really love this technique. But it adds texture and mystery, a little volume, a little bit of value where you might need it. I'm just using that whatever was in my palette, that's sort of a jadeite mix with a little bit of brown, I suppose, in it, and a little bit of blue. This will knock back some of the light here, but I think that's okay. It'll helps concentrate it. Yeah. Also, it allows the bottom of the trees to just vanish a bit into the bottom of the work, which helps push the interest up here, the contrast and clarity up here, where it really will do you some good. Lastly, before that dries, I'm going to use a Perla, Escoda Perla brush. These are beautiful. Can't live without these. They're all synthetic. They make a beautiful point. This is a fairly old one, so I still use it all the time. What I'm doing is mixing up some lavender. It's a Holbein color. It's a semi-opaque. And I'm splattering it, as you can see, on the wet wash at the bottom, and then a little bit up into the dry. So for me, this combination of lavender and deep green is just gorgeous. I love it. And also it looks good on browns. So it looks good on warms and cools. It also gives additional texture, tiny bit of additional value, a little bit. Also up in these areas, I think it sort of implies light sparkles or a bit of mist in the air. You know, this splatter technique has been around forever. I didn't invent it, obviously. I like it, but I also know that you can really overdo it. So a little of that, I think, goes a long way. It has different effects depending on how dry the paper is. If it's very dry, as in there, these little spots will stay pretty much where they hit the paper. As they hit wet paint, depending on how wet, because it's a semi-opaque, it's a heavy pigment, so it sinks down into through the wash and will float up and make these intentional blossoms, which can be very beautiful and can also look really out of place if you overdo this and make too much out of it. So this is quite fun. I love to do it, but again, you can really overdo it. So I think that's enough of that. Also, it adds a little bit of sort of mysterious specificity to the foreground, which helps another indicator to tell you that these trees are forward of everything behind. All right, guys, that's it. I will maybe noodle on this a little bit, but I don't think it needs much, so I'm going to try to follow my own advice. And when a painting tells you it's done, listen to it. Usually it knows more than you do. It's so fun to paint, you want to just keep going, but then you can really ruin whatever's nice. The more paint I put on this, I will run the risk of losing the fluidity and focus and the overall sense of freshness and mystery that I wanted. But this is a memory of a misty evening at the lake at Central Park. The mist itself, the subject of the painting, is the unpainted white paper. Then there's just this hint of the city growing up over the trees in the distance into the glowing warm night air. And then all of it framed by these deep dark scrim of trees I invented in the foreground. There are trees there, they don't really look like this, they're not really in that place. But again, this is not a portrait of this place, it's a memory of it. So anyway, I hope there were things I went over today that are useful to you. And thanks so much for watching and paying attention. And I will see you all again. Thanks a lot.